I stared at the rusted key in my palm, my hands trembling as I realized what I'd found hidden behind the crumbling wallpaper of 1847 Maple Street. 3 hours earlier, I thought I was just cleaning out another abandoned house for a quick paycheck. I had no idea that Robert Henderson, the man who'd lost everything before disappearing into the night, had left me something that would change not just my life, but the entire town of Millbrook forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I run Fresh Start Cleanouts, which is exactly what it sounds like. I'm the person you call when life gets messy, and you need someone to wade through the wreckage. Foreclosed homes, estate sales, hoarder situations, I've seen it all. In a town like Millbrook, Ohio, where half the buildings stand empty and the other half are hanging on by a thread, business stays steady. Not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me independent. The morning Elena Rodriguez called me about the Henderson place, I was nursing my second cup of coffee and trying to ignore the stack of overdue notices on my kitchen table. My one-bedroom apartment wasn't much, but it was mine, and I'd worked my tail off to keep it that way ever since my divorce 2 years ago. Elena's voice carried that particular strain of desperation that real estate agents get when they're dealing with problem properties. "Sarah, I need you to work some magic on 1847 Maple Street," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "The Henderson mansion. Bank wants it cleared out completely before they can even think about listing it. 3 years of neglect, and nobody's been inside since the family fled." I knew the Henderson name, of course. Everyone in Millbrook did. Robert Henderson had built half the town, back in the day, literally. Henderson Construction had put up the school, the library, most of the commercial district. His family had lived in that Victorian mansion on Maple Street for generations, the kind of old money that made them local royalty. Then, about 3 years ago, everything collapsed. Rumors flew about financial irregularities, missed payrolls, projects abandoned mid-construction. One day, Henderson Construction was the biggest employer in town. The next day, the doors were locked, and Bobby Henderson was gone. "What's the timeline?" I asked, already mentally calculating what I'd need to charge for a house that size. 2 weeks, max. I'm not going to lie to you, Sarah. The place is rough. No power, no heat, and God knows what kind of condition everything's in. But the bank is motivated, and they're willing to pay premium rates for discretion. Can you handle it? I thought about my bills, about the business loan payment due next month, about the fact that I hadn't taken a real vacation in 2 years. Send me the details. I'll take a look this afternoon. The Henderson mansion sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, impossible to miss even in its current state of decay. 3 stories of faded grandeur with elaborate woodwork that had once been painted pristine white, but now peeled and curled like old skin. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of fallen leaves and broken shutters. Weeds had claimed the front yard, growing tall enough to brush the first-floor windows. I'd driven past this place countless times over the years, but I'd never really looked at it. Standing there with Elena's key in my hand, I felt something I couldn't quite name. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was wounded, like something vital had been ripped out of it, leaving behind a hollow shell. "Previous owner left in a hurry," Elena said, appearing beside me with a clipboard and that practiced smile real estate agents wear like armor. "Family just walked away from everything. The bank's been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since." I pushed open the heavy front door, and the smell hit me immediately. Not the usual mustiness of an empty house, but something sharper. Disappointment, maybe. If disappointment had a scent, it would smell like the Henderson mansion in autumn. The interior was a time capsule of interrupted life. Furniture covered in dust sheets, family photos still hanging on the walls, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the dining room table. In the study, law books lined the shelves, and papers scattered across an enormous oak desk suggested someone had been working right up until the moment they left. It was like walking through a museum of sudden departure. "I'll need to go through everything systematically," I told Elena. "Documents, personal items, anything that might have value or importance. The bank will want an inventory. Whatever you think is best. Just make it ready for the market." She handed me a business card with her direct number. Call me if you find anything unusual. And Sarah? Like I said, discretion is key here. The Henderson name still carries weight in this town, even after everything. After Elena left, I stood alone in the foyer, looking up at the grand staircase with its carved banister and stained glass window casting colored light across the hardwood floors. I'd cleaned out plenty of houses over the years, but this one felt different. Personal, like I was about to disturb something that had been sleeping. I started with the basics. Opening windows to air out the rooms, testing light switches, mapping out the layout. The house was enormous, easily 5,000 square feet, with rooms that served purposes I could only guess at. A morning room, a conservatory, a butler's pantry. The kind of spaces that belonged to a different era, when families had staff and dinner parties required 3 forks. By the end of the first day, I'd made it through the main floor, documenting everything I found. Photo albums filled with Henderson family history, business awards and civic honors, thank you letters from local organizations. Robert Henderson had been more than just a contractor, he'd been a pillar of the community. The man in these photos, shaking hands with mayors and cutting ribbons at school dedications, didn't look like someone who'd flee in the night. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a legal pad, planning my approach for the rest of the house. 2 weeks seemed like plenty of time for a normal cleanout, but the Henderson place wasn't normal. Every room held layers of history, decades of accumulated life. I needed to be thorough, respectful, and fast. The second day, I tackled the second floor. Bedrooms, bathrooms, a sewing room that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The master bedroom was particularly unsettling. Clothes still hanging in the closet, medications on the nightstand, reading glasses folded on top of a book. Like the occupants had simply evaporated. It was in the smallest bedroom, tucked under the eaves at the back of the house, that I found the first real mystery. Unlike the other rooms, this one had been cleared out deliberately. No furniture, no personal items, just bare walls and dusty hardwood floors. But there was something about the space that nagged at me. The proportions felt wrong, like the room should have been bigger. I spent 20 minutes measuring and remeasuring, comparing the interior dimensions to what I could see from outside. Finally, I found it. A section of wall that sounded hollow when I knocked. The wallpaper was slightly different too, newer than the rest of the room. Someone had sealed off part of the space. My heart started racing. In my line of work, hidden spaces usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone had something valuable to hide, or they'd been hiding from something valuable. Either way, it was worth investigating. I drove to the hardware store and bought a small crowbar, telling myself I was just being thorough. The bank had hired me to clear out the house completely, right? That included finding anything that might have been concealed. Back at the house, I carefully pried away a section of the newer wallpaper and found what I was looking for. A hidden door, maybe 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. The kind of space that might have been used for storage, or during Prohibition for hiding contraband. My hands shook as I worked the crowbar into the gap and pulled. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow space that had been sealed for years. I shined my flashlight into the darkness and gasped. The hidden room was small but packed with items that had been carefully preserved. File boxes, rolled blueprints, and in the center of it all, an old roll-top desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was what sat on top of the desk that made my blood run cold. A white envelope with my name written across it in careful handwriting. Not to the cleaner, or to whom it may concern. Sarah Mitchell. My actual name. I stared at that envelope for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. Robert Henderson had disappeared 3 years ago. I'd only started my cleaning business 18 months ago, and I'd never met the man. How could he possibly have known who I was, let alone that I'd be the one to find his hiding place? With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, neat and purposeful, but the words made my world tilt sideways. Sarah, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. I know you don't understand yet, but you're not here by accident. You're here because you're the only person in Millbrook who can finish what I started. Look in the desk. Look in the files. Look at what they did to me, and more importantly, look at what they're still doing to this town. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to fight, but I had to protect my family. Now it's your turn to protect everyone else. The truth is all there. Use it wisely. Use it well. And remember, sometimes the best way to clean house is to burn it down and start over. Robert Henderson. I read the letter 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. What plan? What truth? What did any of this have to do with me? I set the letter aside and opened the roll-top desk. Inside, I found what looked like years of meticulous record-keeping, folders labeled with dates, locations, and names I recognized from around town. Financial documents, photographs, correspondence, and underneath it all, a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been written in recently. I opened to the first page and found an entry dated just 3 months ago. 3 months ago, when Robert Henderson was supposed to have been long gone from Millbrook. They think I'm dead or disappeared, which is exactly what I wanted them to think. But I've been watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment. The corruption runs deeper than I ever imagined, and it's only getting worse. The zoning board, the planning commission, the city council, they're all in on it. They destroyed my business because I wouldn't play along, and now they're destroying the entire town. But I have everything I need to stop them. I just need someone clean, someone they don't suspect, someone who can get close enough to expose the truth. The journal entries went on for dozens of pages, laying out a conspiracy that reached into every corner of Millbrook's government. Kickbacks, no-bid contracts, properties sold for pennies on the dollar to developers who were in someone's pocket. And at the center of it all, a name that made my stomach drop. James Parker. I knew James Parker. Everyone in Millbrook did. He was the city's economic development director, the man who'd supposedly been working to revitalize our struggling downtown. The same James Parker, who'd been Robert Henderson's business partner before Henderson construction collapsed. The same James Parker, who'd been buying up abandoned properties all over town for redevelopment, that never seemed to happen. According to Henderson's journal, Parker hadn't just been his business partner, he'd been the one orchestrating Henderson's downfall. The financial irregularities, the missed payrolls, the abandoned projects, it had all been orchestrated to drive Henderson out of business, so Parker could sweep in and take over his contracts, his properties, his connections. But Henderson had been documenting everything. The journal entries detailed meeting after meeting where Parker had pushed for decisions that would benefit his own interests. Photos showed Parker meeting with developers at private dinners, envelopes changing hands. Bank records showed money flowing through accounts that shouldn't have existed. I sat on the dusty floor of that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Conspiracy that had been eating away at my town for years, and I realized why Robert Henderson had left me that letter. He'd been watching, waiting, looking for someone who could move freely through Millbrook without raising suspicion. Someone who went into abandoned buildings as part of their job. Someone who had access to spaces that others couldn't reach. He'd chosen me because I was invisible. Just another small business owner trying to make ends meet, cleaning up other people's messes. The perfect cover for someone who needed to gather evidence without being noticed. But there was more. As I dug deeper into the files, I found documents that made my blood run cold. Property assessments that had been deliberately undervalued. Environmental reports that had been falsified. Safety inspections that had been ignored. And at the center of it all, a development plan that would turn Millbrook into something unrecognizable. Parker and his associates weren't just stealing from the city. They were planning to gut it entirely. The historic district would be demolished for a shopping center. The elementary school would be closed and sold to a private company. The library, the community center, the parks, all of it would be parceled off to the highest bidder. The worst part was the timeline. According to the documents, the final phase of the plan was set to begin next month. A vote by the city council that would approve the Millbrook Revitalization Initiative, an innocent-sounding name for what amounted to the systematic destruction of everything that made our town worth saving. I thought about Elena's phone call, about how quickly she'd wanted the Henderson house cleared out. I thought about the bank's urgency, their willingness to pay premium rates for discretion, and I realized that the house itself was part of the plan. The Henderson mansion wasn't just being cleared out for sale, It was being cleared out for demolition. The pieces started falling into place. Parker needed the Henderson property for his development plan, but he couldn't move on it while there was a chance that Robert Henderson might return and reclaim his assets. So he'd waited, let the bank take possession, and then arranged for the house to be quietly cleared out and torn down. No more Henderson Mansion meant no more reminder of what he'd done to its owner. But Robert Henderson had been smarter than Parker realized. He'd anticipated this moment, planned for it, left behind everything I'd need to expose the truth. And somehow, through careful observation and planning, he'd engineered events so that I would be the one to find it. I was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by evidence of corruption and conspiracy, when I heard footsteps downstairs, heavy boots on hardwood, moving through the house with purpose. I quickly gathered up the most important documents and shoved them into my work bag, then closed the hidden door as quietly as I could. "Sarah? You up there?" The voice belonged to David Chen, the elderly man who lived next door. I'd met him briefly the day before, when he'd come over to introduce himself and share stories about the Henderson family. "Coming down," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. I made my way downstairs, trying to look like I'd been doing nothing more suspicious than sorting through old linens. David was standing in the foyer, his weathered face creased with concern. "Saw your truck outside and thought I'd check on you. Long day?" "Getting longer," I said, forcing a smile. "Just trying to make sense of everything up there. The Henderson family really left in a hurry, didn't they?" David's expression grew serious. "Sarah, can I ask you something? How well do you know the people who hired you for this job?" The question caught me off guard. "Elena Rodriguez? I've worked with her before. She's a straight shooter, as far as I know. Why?" "Someone was asking about you yesterday. Man I didn't recognize. Asking questions about your business, how long you'd been in town, who you worked for. Claimed he was thinking about hiring you for a project, but something felt off about it." My heart started racing again. "What kind of questions?" "Personal ones. Where you lived, whether you were married. Did you have family in town? The kind of questions that don't have much to do with cleaning out houses." David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sarah, I've lived next to the Henderson family for 40 years. I know what happened to Bobby wasn't what they said it was. And I know there are people in this town who don't want certain stories told. You need to be careful." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral while my mind raced. Someone was already watching me, already suspicious, which meant I was either on the right track, or I was about to make a very dangerous mistake. "I appreciate the warning," I said. "I'm just here to do a job and get paid. Nothing more complicated than that." David studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. But if you need anything at all, you come see me. I'm usually home, and I've got a clear view of this place from my kitchen window." After he left, I stood in the Henderson foyer, weighing my options. I could pack up what I'd found, take it to the police, and hope that someone in authority would care enough to investigate. But Henderson's journal had made it clear that the corruption reached into multiple levels of city government. Who could I trust? Or I could do what I'd been hired to do. Clean out the house, turn in my inventory, collect my fee, and pretend I'd never found anything more interesting than old photo albums and dusty furniture. It would be safer, simpler, and probably smarter. But as I looked around the house that had once been home to one of Millbrook's most prominent families, I thought about Robert Henderson's letter, about his faith that I would do the right thing, even though he'd never met me, about the town I'd grown up in, the place where I'd built my small business and tried to make a decent life. I thought about all the abandoned houses I'd cleaned out over the past year, the empty storefronts downtown, the young families who'd moved away because there were no jobs left. I thought about the Millbrook I remembered from my childhood, and the shell of a place it had become. And I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to finish what Robert Henderson had started. I was going to expose the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Because sometimes, the best way to clean house really is to burn it down and start over. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. And that meant going back into that hidden room and reading every single document Robert Henderson had left behind. The real work was just beginning. I waited until well after dark before returning to the Henderson mansion, The streetlights on Maple Street had been broken for months, casting the entire block into shadows that seemed perfect for what I needed to do. My hands shook as I unlocked the front door, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. The hidden room felt different in the darkness, more intimate somehow, like I was being welcomed into Robert Henderson's confidence. I'd brought a battery-powered lantern and enough coffee to keep me alert through what I suspected would be a very long night. The documents I'd glimpsed earlier were just the tip of the iceberg. I started with the financial records, spreading them across the hidden room's floor in chronological order. What emerged was a pattern so methodical and ruthless that it took my breath away. James Parker hadn't just destroyed Henderson Construction on a whim. He'd planned it for years, systematically undermining contracts, redirecting city funds, and manipulating zoning decisions to create the perfect storm. The earliest documents dated back almost 7 years, showing Parker's gradual infiltration of city committees and boards. He'd positioned himself as the solution to Millbrook's economic problems, while simultaneously ensuring those problems would get worse. Every failed development project, every business that closed downtown, every family that moved away had been part of his larger design. But the smoking gun was buried in a manila folder marked Riverside Development Corporation. I'd never heard of the company, but according to Henderson's research, it was a shell corporation wholly owned by Parker. For the past 3 years, Riverside had been quietly purchasing distressed properties throughout Millbrook, always paying just enough above market value to avoid suspicion, but far below what the properties were actually worth. The purchase agreements made my stomach turn. The old Miller farmhouse on the outskirts of town sold for $30,000 when comparable properties were worth 3 times that amount. The Kowalski building downtown, a beautiful brick structure that housed 3 small businesses until a suspicious electrical fire forced them to close. The Riverside deal happened 6 weeks later, with the city waiving the usual inspection requirements. Henderson had documented dozens of these transactions, along with the paper trail showing how Parker had manipulated circumstances to drive down property values. Delayed permits, surprise code violations, sudden changes to zoning regulations that made existing businesses non-compliant. Each property that Riverside acquired represented someone's livelihood destroyed, someone's dreams crushed. The scope of it was staggering. Parker wasn't just stealing individual properties. He was stealing the entire town. And the final phase of his plan would legitimize everything through the Millbrook Revitalization Initiative, transforming his illegal accumulation of assets into a legal development project backed by city funds. I found the architectural renderings buried beneath a stack of correspondence. The new Millbrook that Parker envisioned looked nothing like the town I'd grown up in. Glass and steel buildings replaced the historic brick facades downtown. Chain restaurants and big box stores filled the spaces where local businesses had struggled for generations. Even the residential areas would be transformed, with cookie-cutter subdivisions replacing the unique homes that gave each neighborhood its character. But what made me physically ill was the financial projection attached to the renderings. Parker's development company stood to make over $50 million from the project, while the city would be left with decades of debt and a downtown that looked like every other soulless commercial district in America. The correspondence files revealed how he'd sold the project to city officials. Jobs, he'd promised. Economic growth. A brighter future for Millbrook's children. But the fine print told a different story. Most of the construction jobs would go to out-of-state contractors. The new businesses would primarily be franchises owned by national corporations, not local entrepreneurs. And the tax incentives Parker had negotiated meant the city would see almost no revenue from the development for the first 15 years. I was 3 hours into my document review when I found Robert Henderson's personal account of what had happened to him. It was written in the same leather journal I discovered earlier, but these entries were older, dating back to the months before Henderson Construction collapsed. Henderson had figured out what Parker was doing, but too late to save his own business. By the time he'd gathered enough evidence to prove the conspiracy, Parker had already triggered the financial collapse that would destroy Henderson's reputation and force him out of town. The final entries described Henderson's desperate attempts to warn city officials, his growing realization that many of them were already compromised, and his decision to disappear rather than face trumped-up criminal charges. The last entry before Henderson's disappearance was dated 3 years and 4 months ago. It read like a man saying goodbye to everything he'd ever loved. They think they've won, and maybe they have. But I've hidden the truth where they'll never think to look for it. Someday, someone will find what I've left behind. Someone clean, someone they don't suspect, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from seeing justice done. I have to believe that person exists. I have to believe that Millbrook can still be saved. I set the journal aside and wiped tears from my eyes, partly from emotion and partly from the strain of reading by lantern light. Henderson had been right about one thing. I did have nothing to lose. My business was barely breaking even, my personal life was a disaster, and I'd been struggling just to stay afloat since my divorce. But he'd been wrong about something else. I did have something to gain from exposing the truth. And it wasn't justice or righteousness or any other noble ideal. It was revenge. Because as I dug deeper into the financial records, I'd found my own name among Parker's victims. 2 years ago, when my marriage was falling apart and I was desperately trying to establish my cleaning business, I'd applied for a small business loan through the city's economic development program. The loan would have allowed me to buy proper equipment, hire an assistant, maybe even lease a small office space. My application had been rejected, supposedly because my business plan wasn't viable and my financial projections were unrealistic. The rejection letter bore James Parker's signature and contained a paragraph suggesting I might be better suited for traditional employment opportunities more appropriate to my skill level. At the time, I'd been devastated but accepted the decision. After all, what did I know about running a business? Maybe Parker was right. Maybe I was being unrealistic. But now I knew the truth. My loan application hadn't been rejected because it was flawed. It had been rejected because approving small business loans for local entrepreneurs didn't fit Parker's plans for Millbrook. He needed the downtown businesses to fail, needed the economic desperation that would make his development project seem like salvation. I thought about the past 2 years, the nights I'd stayed up until dawn trying to make ends meet, the jobs I'd taken for less than they were worth, just to keep the lights on. I thought about the dreams I'd abandoned, the confidence I'd lost, the way I'd started to believe that maybe I really wasn't cut out for anything better than cleaning up other people's messes. James Parker had stolen more than just property from the people of Millbrook. He'd stolen hope, ambition, the belief that hard work and determination could still mean something in a town that was slowly dying. And he'd done it all while positioning himself as our savior, the man working tirelessly to bring prosperity back to our struggling community. I was still seething over my rejected loan application when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the grimy windows of the hidden room, I could see headlights sweeping across the front yard. Someone had pulled into the Henderson driveway at 2 a.m, and they weren't being particularly subtle about it. I quickly turned off my lantern and listened. Heavy footsteps on the front porch, the rattle of keys in the lock. Whoever was entering the house had legitimate access, which meant they were either working for the bank or they were someone with enough influence to get the keys from Elena Rodriguez. The footsteps moved through the house methodically, room by room, floor by floor. I heard drawers being opened, furniture being moved, the creak of floorboards as multiple people searched the building. They were looking for something specific, and they were being thorough about it. From my hiding place, I could hear voices but couldn't make out words. At least 3 people, possibly 4, and they were clearly familiar with the house's layout. They knew where to look, which meant they'd been here before, or they'd studied the architectural plans. It took them 45 minutes to reach the 2nd floor. I pressed myself against the back wall of the hidden room and tried to control my breathing as they searched the bedrooms. When they reached the small room where I'd discovered the hidden door, my heart nearly stopped. "This is where it should be," a voice said, and I recognized the speaker immediately. James Parker himself, here in the middle of the night, searching for the very evidence I was sitting on top of. "You sure Henderson hid it here?" Another voice, younger, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Positive. We've searched everywhere else, and the architectural plans show this room was modified sometime in the last 5 years. He had to have created a hiding place." I heard them moving around the room, tapping on walls, checking for hollow spaces. My hand found the crowbar I'd used to open the hidden door, and I gripped it tightly. If they found the entrance, I was trapped with nowhere to run. "Hold on," Parker said. "This wallpaper is different, newer, and look at these nail holes where the trim doesn't quite line up." They'd found the hidden door. In a matter of minutes, maybe seconds, they'd figure out how to open it. I looked around desperately for another way out, but the hidden room had only one entrance. I was about to be discovered with a bag full of evidence that could destroy James Parker's entire operation. That's when I made the second decision that would change everything. Instead of cowering in the corner waiting to be caught, I stood up, switched on my lantern, and opened the hidden door myself. "Looking for something?" I said, stepping into the room with the lantern in one hand and the crowbar in the other. 3 men spun around to face me, their faces showing various degrees of shock and anger. Parker recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation in the space of a heartbeat. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, like he was greeting an old friend instead of someone who'd just caught him breaking into a house in the middle of the night. "I should have known. Elena mentioned you were working here, but I didn't expect you to be quite so dedicated to the job." The other 2 men moved to flank me, but Parker held up a hand to stop them. "No need for unpleasantness. I'm sure we can work something out." "Work what out?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You found Henderson's little treasure trove, didn't you? I can see it in your eyes. The question is, what are you planning to do about it?" I looked at the 3 men blocking my exit and realized I was in serious trouble, but I'd spent the last 4 hours reading about what Parker had done to people who got in his way, and I knew that cooperation wasn't going to keep me safe. If anything, it would just make me a liability that needed to be eliminated. "I'm planning to finish the job I was hired to do," I said. "Clean out the house and document everything I find." Parker smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That would be unfortunate. For everyone involved. You see, there are certain documents in that room that could be misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of municipal development. It would be better for the community if those documents simply disappeared. Better for which community? The one that exists now, or the shopping mall you're planning to build on top of it? The smile disappeared entirely. "I see you've been doing more than just cleaning." "That's disappointing, Sarah. I had hoped we could handle this professionally." One of the other men stepped forward, and I got a better look at him in the lantern light. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of expensive haircut that didn't belong in Millbrook at 2 a.m. This wasn't local muscle. This was corporate security, which meant Parker's operation was bigger and more sophisticated than even Henderson had realized. "The thing is," Parker continued, "those documents represent years of work by a disturbed man who was facing serious criminal charges when he disappeared. Robert Henderson was embezzling money from city contracts, falsifying inspection reports, and bribing municipal officials. Everything you found in that room is part of an elaborate attempt to frame innocent people for his own crimes. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, taking Henderson's accusations and flipping them back on their source. If Parker could paint Henderson as the real criminal, then any evidence against him became proof of Henderson's guilt instead." "That's a nice story," I said. "But Henderson's records show bank transfers, meeting photographs, recorded conversations. Hard evidence that tells a very different story. Evidence that can be explained away, misrepresented, or simply discredited by pointing out the source. Who are people going to believe? A respected city official with a proven track record of public service? Or a disgraced contractor who fled town one step ahead of federal investigators?" The scary thing was, he was probably right. Parker had spent years building his reputation while systematically destroying Henderson's. Even with a mountain of evidence, it would be my word against his, and I was nobody special. Just a small business owner with a failed marriage and a grudge against the man who'd rejected her loan application. But Parker had made one crucial mistake. He was assuming I planned to take the evidence to the authorities, to work within the same system he'd already corrupted. He hadn't considered the possibility that I might have learned something from Robert Henderson's example about the futility of playing by rules that had been rigged from the start. "You're right," I said, watching relief flicker across his face. "Nobody would believe me. The evidence would be dismissed, and I'd probably end up facing charges myself." I'm glad you see reason. Now, if you'll just hand over whatever you took from that room, we can forget this ever happened. I might even be able to help you with that loan application you submitted a few years ago. I'm sure we could find some funding for a promising local business. It was the offer that sealed his fate. Parker thought he was being clever, demonstrating his power while offering just enough incentive to ensure my cooperation. What he didn't realize was that mentioning my rejected loan had just confirmed everything I'd read in Henderson's files. He remembered my application specifically, which meant rejecting it had been a deliberate decision, not just standard bureaucratic procedure. That's very generous, I said, but I think I'll pass. Before anyone could react, I switched off the lantern and dove back into the hidden room, pulling the door shut behind me. The room plunged into absolute darkness, but I'd spent hours in here and knew the layout by memory. More importantly, I'd noticed something earlier that Parker and his men hadn't seen yet. The hidden room had a second exit. Henderson had been more paranoid than even his journal entries suggested. The space behind the wall wasn't just a hiding place, it was a safe room with an escape route that led to a narrow staircase built into the house's original structure. The staircase was probably used by servants in the mansion's early days, but Henderson had modified it to provide emergency access to the basement. I felt my way through the darkness, following the wall until I found the concealed panel that Henderson had described in his notes. Behind me, I could hear Parker and his men trying to force open the door I'd just closed. But Henderson had built it well. It would take them several minutes to break through. The servants' staircase was narrow and treacherous in the dark, but it led exactly where Henderson's notes said it would, to a storage room in the basement that connected to the old coal cellar. From there, I could access the tunnel that ran beneath Maple Street to the storm drain system. I'd grown up in Millbrook and knew the storm drains well. Every kid in town had explored them at some point, despite repeated warnings from parents and city officials. The tunnels connected most of the older buildings downtown, a relic from the days when the city had planned a more comprehensive sewer system than they'd ultimately been able to afford. But Henderson had known about the tunnels too, and he'd used them. According to his notes, he'd spent months moving evidence and resources through the underground passages, preparing for the possibility that he'd need to disappear quickly. The basement storage room contained backup copies of everything I'd found upstairs, along with supplies and equipment Henderson had cached for emergencies. I made it to the basement just as I heard the hidden room door finally give way above me. Parker's voice echoed through the house, angry now, shouting orders to his men. They'd discovered the escape route, but they were several minutes behind me and had no idea where the tunnel led. The basement storage room was exactly as Henderson had described it. Waterproof containers held duplicate copies of financial records, photographs, and correspondence. A small safe contained cash, additional documents, and something I hadn't expected: a USB drive labeled insurance policy. I grabbed the drive and as many documents as I could carry, then made my way to the coal cellar. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, but Henderson's notes had included a detailed diagram. Within minutes, I was crawling through a passage that hadn't been used for decades, following a route that would take me 6 blocks away from the Henderson mansion. The storm drain system was larger than I'd remembered from childhood adventures, with multiple branches and connections that made it perfect for losing pursuit. I followed Henderson's mapped route, using my phone's flashlight to navigate tunnels that were alternately too narrow and surprisingly spacious. It took me 45 minutes to reach my intended exit point, a drainage outlet behind the Millbrook Public Library. The library had been built in the 1960s, and its basement connected to the older tunnel system. More importantly, it was far enough from the Henderson mansion that Parker's men wouldn't think to look for me there. I emerged from the tunnels, muddy, exhausted, and carrying evidence that could bring down the most powerful man in Millbrook. But I was also carrying something else, a plan that Robert Henderson had conceived but never had the chance to execute. Henderson's insurance policy USB drive contained more than just additional evidence. It contained a complete strategy for exposing Parker's operation, including contact information for journalists, federal investigators, and reform-minded officials in the state government. Henderson had identified allies who were beyond Parker's reach, people who would be interested in a story about municipal corruption and corporate fraud. But most importantly, the drive contained something that changed everything: proof that Parker's Millbrook Revitalization Initiative was just the test case for a much larger operation. Riverside Development Corporation wasn't just buying properties in Millbrook. They were running identical schemes in dozens of small towns across Ohio and Pennsylvania, systematically looting communities that lacked the resources to fight back. The federal government would be very interested in that information. And unlike local authorities who might be compromised or intimidated, federal investigators had the jurisdiction and resources to build a case that Parker couldn't simply buy his way out of. As I sat in the library parking lot at 3:30 in the morning, reviewing Henderson's files by the light of my phone, I realized that I'd been given something unprecedented. The opportunity to save not just my own town, but dozens of others that were facing the same systematic destruction. But first, I needed to survive long enough to make the evidence public. Parker had seen me, knew who I was, and understood that I represented an existential threat to his entire operation. He wouldn't just try to discredit me or buy me off. He'd try to eliminate me entirely, the same way he'd eliminated Robert Henderson. The difference was that Henderson had been fighting alone, isolated and overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy he'd uncovered. But I had something Henderson hadn't: his roadmap for bringing Parker down, and the knowledge that I wasn't the only person who wanted to see justice done. I thought about David Chen's warning, about someone asking questions about my background and family. Parker had been preparing for this moment, researching me the same way he'd researched all his other victims. But he'd made the same mistake with me that he'd made with Henderson. He'd underestimated how much damage one determined person could do when they had nothing left to lose. Over the next few hours, everything would change. Parker would realize that the evidence was gone and would move to damage control mode. He'd try to discredit me, intimidate me, possibly worse. But he'd also have to worry about what else I might have found, what other copies might exist, who else might know about his operation. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And unlike Robert Henderson, I didn't plan to disappear quietly into the night. I was going to burn James Parker's empire to the ground, and I was going to do it in broad daylight where everyone could see the flames. By dawn, I was sitting in my apartment, with Henderson's evidence spread across every available surface, trying to make sense of the full scope of what I'd discovered. The USB drive had been even more revealing than I'd initially realized. Henderson hadn't just been documenting Parker's crimes. He'd been building a comprehensive case that reached far beyond Millbrook city limits. The files on the drive showed that Riverside Development Corporation was part of a network of shell companies operating across the Midwest. Each company targeted a different region, but they all followed the same playbook: infiltrate local government, manipulate property values, acquire distressed assets, then push through development projects that would legitimize their acquisitions while maximizing profits. What made the scheme particularly insidious was how it exploited the economic desperation of small towns. Communities that had been hit hard by factory closures and population decline were especially vulnerable to promises of revitalization. Local officials, faced with shrinking tax bases and mounting infrastructure costs, were often willing to overlook questionable deals if they offered any hope of economic recovery. But the promised recovery never materialized. Instead, the development projects stripped away whatever character and local identity these towns still possessed, replacing them with generic commercial spaces that provided temporary construction jobs but no lasting economic benefit. Once the projects were complete, the development companies would sell their assets to national chains and move on to the next target, leaving behind communities that were worse off than when they'd started. I found detailed financial records showing how the scheme worked. Riverside and its associated companies would use initial property acquisitions to establish a footprint in target communities. Then they'd leverage those holdings to secure municipal bonds and development loans, using the town's own credit to finance projects that primarily benefited the developers. When the projects inevitably failed to generate the promised economic returns, the companies would declare bankruptcy and walk away, leaving the communities holding millions of dollars in debt. Millbrook wasn't even close to being Parker's biggest target. The files showed ongoing operations in communities throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, with total projected profits exceeding $200 million. Some towns had already been completely transformed, their historic downtowns demolished and replaced with strip malls and chain restaurants. Others were in various stages of the process, their local governments slowly being corrupted, and their property markets manipulated. But what shocked me most was discovering how sophisticated the operation really was. This wasn't just a regional scam run by a corrupt city official. Riverside Development Corporation was connected to a national consulting firm that specialized in municipal finance, a lobbying group that pushed for favorable legislation in state capitals, and a network of lawyers and accountants who helped structure deals to minimize legal exposure. Henderson had identified the key players in this network, along with their roles in the larger scheme. James Parker was just a mid-level operative, important to Millbrook but replaceable within the broader organization. The real power lay with people I'd never heard of, operating from offices in Chicago and Atlanta, treating small towns like commodities to be harvested, rather than communities deserving protection. The scope of it was overwhelming, but it also presented an opportunity. If I could expose the network rather than just Parker's individual crimes, I could potentially save dozens of communities from suffering Millbrook's fate. Federal authorities would be very interested in a case involving interstate fraud, municipal corruption, and conspiracy charges that could reach into multiple states. But first, I needed to deal with my immediate situation. Parker knew I had the evidence, and he wouldn't wait long before taking action to neutralize the threat I represented. I needed allies, protection, and a way to get the information to people who could act on it before Parker could silence me permanently. I started with Henderson's contact list, beginning with Lisa Martinez, an investigative journalist who worked for a regional newspaper based in Columbus. According to Henderson's notes, Martinez had been researching municipal corruption cases throughout Ohio and had expressed interest in examining the relationship between development projects and local government decision-making. I called her office number at 8 in the morning, expecting to reach voicemail but hoping she might be an early riser. To my surprise, she answered on the second ring. "Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd probably been up late working on deadline. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling from Millbrook, and I have information about a story you might be interested in. It involves municipal corruption, development fraud, and a conspiracy that reaches far beyond one small town." There was a pause, and I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. "What kind of information?" "Documents, financial records, recorded conversations, photographs, evidence of a systematic scheme to defraud municipalities and manipulate property markets across multiple states." "Are you familiar with James Parker or Riverside Development Corporation?" "Should I be?" I spent the next 10 minutes giving her a condensed version of what I'd discovered, focusing on the facts that were easiest to verify and the scope of the larger operation. Martinez asked pointed questions about the source of my information and the nature of the evidence I'd found. "This, Robert Henderson," she said when I'd finished. "You said he disappeared 3 years ago under suspicious circumstances. How do I know these documents are legitimate and not some kind of elaborate hoax?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been anticipating. The financial records include bank account numbers, transaction dates, and specific amounts that can be verified through public records. The photographs show meetings between Parker and known developers with timestamps and location data. And the correspondence includes references to events and decisions that were reported in local newspapers. Can you prove Henderson actually created these documents? Some of them are in his handwriting, which could be verified through comparison with documents he filed with the city over the years. Others are printed emails and financial statements that would have digital trails if law enforcement subpoenaed the relevant accounts. Martinez was quiet for a moment, and I could hear typing in the background. "Where are you right now, Sarah?" "At home." "Why?" "Because if what you're telling me is true, you're in serious danger. People who run operations like the one you're describing don't hesitate to eliminate threats, especially when those threats involve federal crimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The casual way she said it made my blood run cold. I'd been so focused on the evidence and its implications that I hadn't fully processed the personal risk I was facing. But Martinez was right. Parker and his associates had made Robert Henderson disappear when he'd gotten too close to the truth. They wouldn't hesitate to do the same to me. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "First, make copies of everything and store them in multiple secure locations. Second, don't go anywhere alone and vary your routine so you're not predictable. Third, document everything that happens from this point forward. If something happens to you, it becomes part of the story." Her matter-of-fact tone was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. This was clearly a woman who'd dealt with dangerous stories before, but her advice also confirmed that the danger was real and immediate. "I can drive up to Columbus today," she continued. "Bring whatever evidence you can safely transport, and we'll go through it together. But Sarah, once we start down this path, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" I thought about Robert Henderson's letter, about his faith that someone would finish what he'd started. I thought about my rejected loan application, about all the other small business owners who'd been denied opportunities so that Parker's scheme could succeed. I thought about the families who'd left Millbrook because there were no jobs, no prospects, no hope for the future. "I'm certain," I said. "When and where do you want to meet?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the state capitol building at 2 p.m. Martinez suggested I take a circuitous route and watch for anyone who might be following me. She also recommended I tell someone trustworthy where I was going, just in case something went wrong. After hanging up, I spent an hour organizing the most important documents into a portable file and creating digital copies of everything on Henderson's USB drive. I burned multiple copies onto blank disks and uploaded encrypted versions to a secure cloud storage account. If Parker's people managed to intercept me, they'd get some of the evidence, but not all of it. The knock on my apartment door came at 9:30, just as I was preparing to leave for Columbus. Through the peephole, I could see Elena Rodriguez standing in the hallway, but something about her posture seemed wrong. She was holding herself too stiffly, and her usual confident smile was replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. I opened the door with the chain still engaged. "Elena? What are you doing here?" "Sarah, we need to talk. There's been a development with the Henderson property that affects your contract." "What kind of development?" "The kind that's better discussed inside. May I come in?" Every instinct I had was screaming danger, but Elena had been the one who'd hired me for the Henderson job in the first place. If she was involved with Parker's operation, then I'd been walking into a trap from the very beginning. I closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it again. Elena stepped inside, but she wasn't alone. 2 men followed her, both wearing dark suits that didn't quite hide the bulges of shoulder holsters underneath. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Elena said, and I could see genuine regret in her eyes. "I didn't want it to come to this." "Let me guess," I said, backing toward my kitchen where I'd left my phone. "James Parker wants to have a conversation." One of the men moved to block my path while the other closed and locked the front door. "Mr. Parker is waiting in the car outside. He'd like you to join him for a brief discussion about your findings at the Henderson property." "And if I refuse?" The man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Parker is confident you'll see the wisdom in cooperation." I looked at Elena, trying to understand how she fit into all of this. "How long have you been working for him?" 3 years, she said quietly. "Ever since my real estate business started failing. Parker offered me a way out, and I took it. I've been helping him identify and acquire properties, managing the paperwork, coordinating with contractors. And if I'd found nothing at the Henderson house, then you'd have completed your job and been paid as promised. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? You had to go looking for secrets that weren't meant to be found." The irony wasn't lost on me. Elena had unknowingly hired me to clean out the very house where Robert Henderson had hidden the evidence that would destroy her employer. Parker's scheme was so complex that even his own operatives didn't understand all the moving parts. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you get in the car, have a conversation with Mr. Parker, and hopefully reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved," the first man said. "Millbrook is a small town, Sarah. It would be a shame if something happened to disrupt the peaceful life you've built here." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Parker had researched my background, knew where I lived, understood my vulnerabilities. But he'd also made the same mistake that seemed to plague everyone who underestimated me. He assumed I'd be intimidated into compliance. "All right," I said. "Let me grab my purse and we can go." I walked toward my bedroom, moving slowly and keeping my hands visible. The man who'd been blocking my path stayed close behind me, but he wasn't expecting what happened next. I'd spent 2 years as a single woman living alone in a town with a growing crime problem. My bedroom contained more than just clothes and personal items. Hidden in my nightstand was a .38 revolver I'd bought after my divorce, along with the concealed carry permit I'd obtained after someone broke into my apartment 6 months ago. The gun was loaded and ready. I'd practiced with it regularly at a shooting range outside of town, not because I ever expected to use it, but because I believed in being prepared for situations exactly like this one. I spun around and had the weapon pointed at the man's chest before he could react. His hand moved toward his own gun, but stopped when he saw that I already had mine trained on him. "Tell your friend to back away from the door," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Sarah, don't do anything stupid," Lena said. "These men are professionals. Even if you get past them, Parker has resources you can't imagine." "Maybe," I said. "But right now, I'm the one with the gun pointed at someone's heart. Tell your friend to move away from the door, or we'll find out just how professional he really is." The man I was facing nodded to his partner, who reluctantly stepped aside. I could see him calculating angles, trying to figure out if he could draw and fire before I could pull my trigger. But he was too far away to reach me before I could shoot his partner, and that created a stalemate that worked in my favor. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're all going to leave my apartment. You're going to tell Parker that I'm not interested in having a conversation with him. And you're going to explain that if anything happens to me, to my friends, or to my property, there are copies of Henderson's evidence in the hands of people who will make sure the whole story becomes public." "You're making a mistake," the first man said. "Parker is offering you a way out of this situation. If you refuse his generosity, the consequences will be severe." "The consequences are already severe," I replied. "The only question is whether they fall on me or on him." I kept the gun trained on them while they backed toward the door. Elena looked like she wanted to say something else, but her escorts weren't interested in prolonging the conversation. They understood that their intimidation tactics had failed, and staying longer would only increase the risk of the situation escalating beyond their control. After they left, I locked the door and immediately called Lisa Martinez to let her know my situation had become more urgent. She listened without interrupting as I described what had just happened. "Change of plans," she said when I'd finished. "Don't drive to Columbus. Find somewhere public and stay there until I can arrange protection for you." This story just became a federal case. "What do you mean?" The coffee shop on Main Street was busier than I'd expected for a Tuesday morning, which worked perfectly for what I needed. I chose a table near the back, where I could see both entrances while keeping my laptop bag close. Lisa Martinez had been right about finding somewhere public, but she'd also warned me that Parker's people wouldn't hesitate to approach me even in a crowded space. I'd been there for 20 minutes when a woman in a navy blazer approached my table. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings as she moved. "Sarah Mitchell?" she said, extending her hand. "Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI. Lisa Martinez asked me to meet with you." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way she positioned herself to keep the room in view. That was fast. "Ms. Martinez has been feeding us information about municipal corruption cases for the past year. When she called this morning about interstate fraud and conspiracy charges, we were very interested." Torres sat down across from me, declining my offer to buy her coffee. "Tell me about Robert Henderson." I spent the next hour walking her through everything I'd discovered, starting with the hidden room and ending with the morning's confrontation in my apartment. Torres took notes on a small tablet, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I mentioned the USB drive and the evidence of operations in multiple states, her expression became noticeably more focused. "You said Henderson documented operations in how many states?" "At least 5 that I saw clearly, but there were references to others. Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky. The financial records suggest they've been working this scheme for at least 7 years, maybe longer." Torres nodded. "We've been tracking unusual patterns in municipal bond issues and development projects across the Midwest, but we hadn't connected them to a single organization. The evidence you found could be the key to understanding how the whole network operates." She leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. If these people are operating at the scale you're describing, they have significant resources and connections. The fact that they sent people to your apartment this morning means they see you as a serious threat." "What are you suggesting?" Witness protection, at least temporarily. We can move you to a secure location while we verify the evidence and begin building cases against the people involved. It's not a decision you have to make right now, but it's something you should consider. The idea of leaving Millbrook, even temporarily, felt like admitting defeat. This was my home, my business, my life, but I also understood that staying might mean risking everything I'd worked to build, including my life itself. How long would it take to verify the evidence? For the financial records and documents, probably a few weeks. For the larger conspiracy case, months or even years. This kind of investigation requires coordination between multiple field offices, state authorities, and potentially international agencies if the money trail leads overseas. I thought about Henderson's journal entries, about his growing isolation as he'd realized the scope of what he was fighting. He'd tried to work within the system, trusting that the truth would be enough to protect him and his family. Instead, he'd been forced to disappear, leaving behind everything he'd cared about. What if I don't want protection? What if I want to stay and fight? Torres studied my face for a moment. Then we'd do everything we could to keep you safe while using your evidence to build the strongest possible case. But I have to be honest with you, the risk would be significant. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to use intimidation and violence to protect their interests. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. Coffee's getting cold. Time to come outside. Torres saw my expression change and immediately reached for her own phone. What is it? I showed her the message. She stood up, scanning the coffee shop in the street beyond the windows. How many people besides Martinez knew you'd be here? Nobody. I didn't tell anyone where I was going after your people left my apartment. Then they've been tracking you. Torres was already moving toward the back of the coffee shop, gesturing for me to follow. Is there a rear exit? The barista pointed us toward a door that led to an alley behind the building. Torres drew her weapon as we moved, keeping it low but ready. The alley was empty except for a delivery truck and several dumpsters, but Torres clearly wasn't taking any chances. My car is 2 blocks over, she said. We're going to move quickly and quietly. If anyone approaches us, get behind me and stay down. We made it halfway to her car before the black sedan turned into the street ahead of us. Torres immediately changed direction, pulling me toward a narrow passage between 2 buildings. Behind us, I could hear car doors slamming and footsteps on pavement. This way, Torres said, leading me through a maze of alleys that connected the commercial district to the residential neighborhoods beyond. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd studied the area's layout, probably as soon as Martinez had called about meeting with me. We emerged 3 blocks from where we'd started, in a parking lot behind the old Woolworth building. Torres's car was a nondescript gray sedan that looked like it belonged to any insurance salesman or traveling businessman. She had us inside and moving within seconds. Where are we going? I asked. Somewhere safe while we figure out our next move. Torres was already on her radio, speaking in the kind of coded language that suggested this wasn't her first emergency evacuation. We need to assume they've compromised your apartment, your business, and any other locations you frequent regularly. As we drove out of Millbrook, I watched my hometown shrink in the rearview mirror and wondered if I'd ever see it the same way again. The streets I'd grown up on, the businesses I'd supported, the neighbors I'd known for years, how many of them were part of Parker's network, either willingly or unknowingly. Torres took us to a safe house about an hour outside of town, a modest ranch house in a subdivision that looked like it had been built in the 1980s and carefully maintained ever since. The interior was clean but impersonal, furnished with the kind of generic furniture that could be found in any mid-range hotel. This is temporary, Torres explained as she showed me to a bedroom. We use it for witness interviews and short-term protection situations. You'll be safe here while we process the evidence and coordinate with other agencies. I spent the rest of the day going through Henderson's files with Torres and 2 other agents who'd arrived from the Columbus field office. They were particularly interested in the financial records, which showed patterns of money movement that suggested the corruption network was even larger than Henderson had realized. Look at this, said Agent Miller, the older of the 2 newcomers. He was examining bank records that showed transfers between Riverside Development Corporation and a company called Great Lakes Municipal Services. GLMS provides consulting services to city governments throughout the region. They help structure bond issues, negotiate development contracts, manage large construction projects. Henderson mentions them in his journal, I said, pulling out the relevant entries. He says they were the ones who recommended Parker for the economic development position in Millbrook. But he also suggests they were coordinating with Parker to manipulate city contracts. Torres looked up from her own stack of documents. If Great Lakes Municipal Services is part of this network, then we're looking at a conspiracy that reaches into dozens of communities. They've been positioning themselves as the solution to municipal financial problems while actually creating those problems. The third agent, a young woman named Chen, had been working on Henderson's correspondence files. I'm seeing references to something called the Heartland Initiative. It looks like a coordinated plan to acquire and redevelop properties in economically distressed communities throughout the Midwest. She spread out several documents on the kitchen table. According to these memos, the goal is to control key properties in target communities, then push through development projects that will gentrify the areas and price out existing residents. The displaced families and businesses become dependent on services provided by other companies in the network. I felt sick as the full scope of the scheme became clear. This wasn't just about stealing money or manipulating property values. It was about systematically destroying communities and rebuilding them to serve corporate interests rather than the people who actually lived there. How many communities are we talking about? I asked. Miller consulted a spreadsheet he'd been compiling. Based on what we've seen so far, at least 47 cities and towns across 5 states. Some are in early stages where they're just beginning to infiltrate local government. Others are nearly complete, with most of the target properties already acquired and development projects underway. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of families displaced, hundreds of small businesses destroyed, entire communities transformed beyond recognition. And it was all being done legally, through manipulation of existing laws and regulations, rather than outright criminal activity. The beautiful thing about their system, Torres said grimly, is that most of what they're doing isn't technically illegal. They're exploiting weaknesses in municipal finance laws and taking advantage of communities that don't have the resources to understand what's happening to them. So how do we stop them? By proving the conspiracy, Miller said. Individual instances of corruption might be hard to prosecute, but coordinated fraud across state lines is a federal crime. If we can show that this network has been systematically defrauding municipalities and manipulating property markets, we can bring charges under the RICO Act. Chen looked up from her laptop. I've been cross-referencing the financial data with public records from the target communities. The pattern is incredibly consistent. Property values drop artificially due to zoning changes and permit delays. Riverside or one of its shell companies acquires the properties at below-market prices. Then municipal bonds are issued to fund development projects that primarily benefit the same companies that bought the properties. It's brilliant, in a sociopathic way, Torres said. They're using the community's own credit to finance their own enrichment, then leaving the taxpayers to deal with the debt while they move on to the next target. As the afternoon wore on, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Henderson had been more thorough than any of us had initially realized. He'd not only documented the financial fraud, but had also identified the network of lawyers, accountants, consultants, and local officials who made the scheme possible. The operation was structured like a franchise, with each regional manager like Parker responsible for implementing the same basic strategy in their assigned territories. They shared resources, coordinated timing to avoid drawing attention, and used the same legal and financial structures to minimize their exposure to prosecution. But Henderson had also identified the network's weakness. They were so confident in their legal protection that they'd become careless about operational security. The evidence he'd gathered included not just financial records, but also recorded conversations, photographs of meetings, and email exchanges that clearly showed the conspiracy in action. This is enough to bring down the entire network, Miller said as we finished reviewing the last of the documents. But we need to move carefully. If they realize how much evidence we have, they'll start destroying records and fleeing the country. Torres nodded. We'll need to coordinate simultaneous raids in multiple states, freeze assets before they can be moved offshore, and ensure that key witnesses are protected. This is going to be one of the largest municipal corruption cases in federal history. As evening approached, I found myself sitting on the safe house's back porch, looking out at a yard that reminded me of my childhood home. The whole day felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. 24 hours earlier, I'd been Sarah Mitchell, small business owner, struggling to make ends meet in a dying town. Now I was a federal witness in a conspiracy case that could reshape how municipal development was regulated across the country. Torres joined me on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How are you holding up?" "I keep thinking about Robert Henderson," I said. "He spent years documenting all of this, knowing that exposing it would probably destroy his life. And in the end, it did. He lost everything. His business, his reputation, his family, his home. Was it worth it? Ask me that question in a year, when we've shut down their operation and returned stolen assets to the communities they've defrauded," Torres replied. "Henderson couldn't finish the fight, but he made it possible for us to win it. What happens to Millbrook? Even if we stop Parker and his associates, the damage has already been done. The businesses that closed, the families that moved away, the trust that's been broken, how do you rebuild from that?" Torres was quiet for a moment, one step at a time. One honest decision after another. One person willing to stand up and say this isn't right, even when it would be easier to look the other way. She was right, of course. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't happen without people being willing to take risks and make sacrifices. Henderson had started the process by gathering evidence and hiding it where someone like me could find it. Now it was my turn to see it through, regardless of the personal cost. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my neighbor David Chen's number. "Sarah? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. There are strange men watching your apartment, and someone broke into your office this afternoon." I felt my stomach drop. "Are you okay? Did anyone get hurt?" "I'm fine, but your office is a mess. They tore the place apart like they were looking for something specific. And Sarah, there's something else. Elena Rodriguez was here an hour ago asking if I knew where you'd gone. She seemed very nervous." Torres had been listening to my side of the conversation. She held out her hand and I gave her the phone. "Mr. Chen? This is Agent Torres with the FBI. Ms. Mitchell is safe, but we need you to be very careful. The people who broke into her office may try to approach you or other neighbors for information about her whereabouts." I could hear David's voice through the phone, but couldn't make out his words. Torres listened for a few moments, then handed the phone back to me. "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever you've gotten yourself into, you're doing the right thing," David said. "I've lived in Millbrook for 40 years, and I've watched this town slowly die while people like Parker got rich. If you've found a way to fight back, then I support you completely." After hanging up, I realized that I'd made my decision. I wasn't going into witness protection, and I wasn't going to hide while other people fought the battle that Henderson had started. I was going to stay involved, stay visible, and make sure that everyone in Millbrook understood exactly what had been done to them. "I want to go back," I told Torres. "Sarah, that's not safe. They know you have the evidence, and they know we're building a case. Going back to Millbrook would be walking into a trap." "Maybe, but it would also be making a statement that the people of Millbrook deserve to know the truth, and that I'm not going to be intimidated into silence." Torres studied my face in the fading light. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A town hall meeting. Public, well-attended, with media coverage. I tell the whole story, show the evidence, and let the community decide what they want to do about it. Make it impossible for Parker and his associates to operate in the shadows." "That would certainly force their hand," Torres said. "But it would also put you in extreme danger. They can't afford to let you expose their operation publicly. Then we make sure I'm protected. Federal agents in the audience, local police who haven't been compromised, media coverage that would make it impossible for me to disappear quietly." Torres was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Finally, she nodded. "It could work. If we do it right, it could actually be safer than trying to keep you hidden indefinitely. But it would have to be soon, before they have time to organize a response. How soon? This weekend, Saturday evening, when we can ensure maximum attendance and media coverage. That gives us 3 days to coordinate security and prepare your presentation. As we went back inside to start planning, I thought about Henderson's final journal entry, about his faith that someone would finish what he'd started. He'd been right to believe that the truth would eventually come out, but he'd underestimated something important: the power of bringing that truth into the light where everyone could see it. Parker and his associates had been able to operate for years because they'd kept their activities hidden, compartmentalized, deniable. But once the whole community understood what had been done to them, the conspiracy would lose its most important protection: the ignorance and isolation of its victims. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time since I'd found Henderson's letter, I felt like we had a chance to win. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. By 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread through town faster than I'd expected, helped by David Chen and other neighbors who'd spent the week quietly letting people know that something important was going to be revealed about the town's recent struggles. I stood backstage, trying to calm my nerves while Agent Torres ran through the security arrangements one final time. Federal agents were positioned throughout the audience, and local police officers who'd been vetted by the FBI were stationed at all the exits. Lisa Martinez and 2 other journalists were setting up cameras and recording equipment, ensuring that whatever happened tonight would be documented and broadcast beyond Millbrook's borders. "Remember," Torres said, checking her earpiece, "stick to the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. Don't get drawn into personal attacks or speculation. Just tell the story exactly as you discovered it." I nodded, though my mouth was too dry to speak. 3 days of preparation had gone by in a blur of meetings, document review, and coordination with federal prosecutors who would be filing charges as soon as the investigation went public. Tonight would mark the point of no return for everyone involved. Marie Thompson, who'd helped organize the meeting, appeared at my elbow. "Sarah, we're ready for you." I walked onto the stage to scattered applause and a sea of familiar faces. These were my neighbors, my customers, people I'd known my entire life. I could see curiosity in their expressions, but also skepticism. After years of broken promises and failed initiatives, Millbrook residents had learned to be wary of anyone claiming to have solutions to their problems. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and most of you know me as the owner of Fresh Start Cleanouts. What you don't know is that 2 weeks ago, I was hired to clean out the Henderson mansion on Maple Street. What I found there has changed not just my understanding of our town's recent struggles, but my understanding of how those struggles were deliberately created." A murmur ran through the audience. I could see James Parker sitting in the 3rd row, flanked by 2 men I recognized from the confrontation at my apartment. His presence was bold, but it also suggested he was confident he could control whatever narrative emerged from tonight's meeting. "Before I share what I discovered, I want you to understand that nothing I'm about to tell you is speculation or rumor. Everything is documented, verified, and has been reviewed by federal investigators. The story I'm going to tell you is about systematic fraud, municipal corruption, and a conspiracy that reaches far beyond Millbrook's borders." I clicked to my first slide, showing a photograph of the hidden room where I'd found Henderson's evidence. This is where Robert Henderson hid the truth about what was happening to our town. For 3 years, we've been told that Henderson fled because he was facing criminal charges for financial irregularities. Tonight, you'll learn that Robert Henderson was actually the victim of a conspiracy designed to destroy his business and steal his assets. The next slide showed Henderson's photograph alongside James Parker's. The man responsible for orchestrating Henderson's destruction is sitting in this room tonight. James Parker, our economic development director, has been systematically looting our community while positioning himself as our savior. Parker stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he called out. "Sarah Mitchell is a disgruntled small business owner who was rejected for a loan and is now making wild accusations to get revenge." "Sit down, James," called a voice from the back of the room. I was surprised to see that it belonged to Tom Bradley, Henderson's former construction foreman. "Let her speak." Parker remained standing, but he didn't leave. Torres had warned me that he'd try to disrupt the presentation, but she'd also assured me that he wouldn't be able to stop it. I clicked to the next slide, showing the organizational chart that Henderson had created to map Parker's network. Riverside Development Corporation, Great Lakes Municipal Services, and 4 other companies have been working together to acquire properties throughout our region at artificially reduced prices. They create the economic conditions that force property sales, then profit from development projects funded with municipal bonds. The audience was completely quiet now, their attention focused on the screen where I was displaying photographs of Parker meeting with developers, bank records showing suspicious transfers, and emails discussing strategies for manipulating zoning decisions. Over the past 5 years, I continued, this network has acquired over 200 properties in Millbrook alone. The Henderson mansion where I found this evidence was scheduled to be demolished next month as part of a development project that would have generated millions of dollars in profits for Parker's associates while leaving our community with decades of debt. I could see shock and growing anger in the faces around me. These were people who'd watched their towns slowly die, who'd seen friends and family move away as opportunities disappeared. Learning that this decline had been deliberately orchestrated was transforming their confusion and resignation into fury. The scheme works like this, I said, clicking to a flowchart that Henderson had created. First, they infiltrate local government through people like Parker, who position themselves as community advocates. Then they use their positions to create regulatory obstacles that drive down property values. Finally, they acquire the distressed properties and push through development projects that eliminate local competition while maximizing their own profits. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. I recognized her as Mrs. Kowalski, whose family had owned the downtown building that burned under suspicious circumstances. Are you saying that the fire at our building wasn't an accident? I hesitated, looking at Torres, who nodded slightly. The evidence suggests that the electrical problems that caused the fire were the result of delayed maintenance approvals and inspection irregularities. Your building was deliberately allowed to deteriorate until it became unsafe. Mrs. Kowalski's face went white, then red with rage. Around the room, other people were beginning to connect their own experiences to the patterns I was describing. The restaurant owner whose permit applications had been inexplicably delayed. The shop owner whose lease had been canceled when the building was sold to an out-of-state developer. The families whose homes had been condemned due to sudden code violations. How many communities has this happened to? Someone called out. At least 47 that we've identified so far across 5 states. The total estimated fraud exceeds $200 million. I clicked to a map showing the locations where similar schemes had been implemented. Millbrook wasn't randomly targeted. We were chosen because we fit a specific profile. Economically distressed, politically isolated, lacking the resources to resist systematic exploitation. The anger in the room was becoming palpable. People were standing up, talking to their neighbors, pointing at Parker, who was still trying to maintain his composure, but I could see cracks beginning to show in his confident facade. What can we do about it? Tom Bradley asked from the back. Federal investigators are already building cases against the people responsible, I said. But the legal process will take time, and it won't automatically repair the damage that's been done to our community. That will require something else. The willingness to rebuild based on principles of transparency, accountability, and genuine community benefit. I clicked to my final slide, showing a photograph of Millbrook's downtown as it had looked 20 years ago, before the systematic destruction began. This is what we've lost, but it's also what we can work together to restore, if we're willing to make the commitment. The applause started slowly, then built to a sustained ovation. But it wasn't celebratory applause. It was the sound of people who'd finally understood what had been done to them and were ready to do something about it. Parker finally sat down, but I could see him texting furiously on his phone. Whatever backup plan he'd prepared was probably being activated right now. The question and answer session that followed was intense and emotional. People shared stories of businesses lost, homes sold under pressure, dreams abandoned because of circumstances they'd thought were beyond anyone's control. As the pieces came together, the scope of the betrayal became clear to everyone in the room. "Why should we believe you?" called out a man I didn't recognize. "How do we know this isn't just another scam?" Before I could answer, David Chen stood up. Because I've known Sarah Mitchell her entire life, and she's never lied about anything. More importantly, because what she's telling us explains everything that's happened to this town over the past 5 years. Marie Thompson nodded in agreement. Sarah's evidence answers questions that have been bothering me for years. Why did the city council suddenly change zoning regulations that had been in place for decades? Why were permit applications being delayed for local businesses while out-of-state developers seemed to get immediate approval? Why did every revitalization project seem to benefit the same group of people? The validation from respected community members seemed to settle the remaining doubts in the room. Parker's face had gone from angry to resigned, and I could see him calculating his exit strategy. "What happens to Parker?" someone asked. Torres stepped forward, showing her badge. "Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI. Mr. Parker and his associates are being arrested tonight on federal charges of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. This investigation involves multiple agencies and will result in prosecutions in several states." As if on cue, federal agents who'd been positioned throughout the audience moved toward Parker and the men sitting with him. Parker didn't resist as handcuffs were applied, but his expression was one of calculating fury rather than defeat. "This isn't over," he said as he was led toward the exit. "You people have no idea what you're interfering with." "Actually, we do," I called after him. "And that's exactly why we're stopping it." After Parker was removed, the meeting continued for another hour. People wanted to understand the legal process, the timeline for recovering stolen assets, and the prospects for rebuilding what had been destroyed. Torres and the federal prosecutors who joined us provided what information they could, while emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and many details couldn't be discussed publicly yet. But the most important conversations were happening between neighbors who were beginning to envision what Millbrook could become if it were allowed to develop according to its residents' actual needs and desires, rather than corporate profit motives. "We need to form a citizen oversight committee," suggested Tom Bradley. "Something to make sure that whatever development happens here benefits the community instead of outside investors. And we need to support local businesses," added Mrs. Kowalski. "If we're going to rebuild, it should be with people who actually live here and care about what happens to the town." As the meeting wound down, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to thank me, ask questions, or share their own stories of how Parker's schemes had affected their lives. The response was overwhelming, but it was also energizing. For the first time in years, Millbrook felt like a community again, rather than just a collection of individuals struggling alone. Lisa Martinez approached me as the crowd began to thin. "This story is going to have national impact," she said. "What you've exposed here isn't just about one corrupt official or one struggling town. It's about a systematic assault on American communities that's been happening largely unnoticed. What comes next? Federal trials, asset recovery, probably legislative hearings about how to prevent this kind of fraud in the future. But the real work will be what happens here in Millbrook. You've given people the truth, but they'll have to decide what to do with it." As I packed up my presentation materials, I thought about Robert Henderson's letter and his faith that someone would finish what he'd started. Tonight, I'd done more than just expose the truth about what had happened to Millbrook. I'd given my community the information they needed to take control of their own future. The fight wasn't over. Parker and his associates would undoubtedly appeal their convictions, try to minimize their sentences, and probably attempt to continue their operations from prison. The federal investigation would take years to complete, and recovering stolen assets would be a complex legal process. But something fundamental had changed in Millbrook tonight. People understood what had been done to them, why it had happened, and what they could do to prevent it from happening again. They'd seen that resistance was possible, that ordinary citizens could fight back against systematic exploitation and win. As I walked out of the community center, I passed the Henderson mansion on Maple Street. It looked different now that I knew its history, less like a monument to past grandeur, and more like a symbol of resilience. Robert Henderson had lost his battle, but he'd made it possible for his community to win the war. The house would be restored now, turned into something that actually served the community rather than just housing someone else's dreams. And in a small way, that transformation would represent what was happening to Millbrook itself. The the reclamation of a place that belonged to its people, rather than to whoever had enough money and power to take it away from them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new attempts by powerful interests to shape Millbrook according to their priorities rather than its residents' needs. But tonight had proven that those attempts could be resisted, that the truth was more powerful than money, and that communities could still determine their own destinies if they were willing to stand together and fight for them. I drove home through streets that looked the same as they had that morning but felt completely different. This was still my town, but now it was also a town that knew how to defend itself, and that made all the difference in the world. 6 months after the town hall meeting that changed everything, I stood in the renovated Henderson mansion, now serving as Millbrook's Community Development Center. The hidden room where I'd discovered Robert Henderson's evidence had been preserved as a small museum, complete with displays showing how citizens could recognize and resist municipal corruption. It seemed fitting that the space where the truth had been hidden was now dedicated to ensuring transparency. The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks earlier with convictions for James Parker and 17 associates across 5 states. The RICO charges had stuck, resulting in sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years in federal prison. More importantly, the asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered over $60 million that was being returned to defrauded communities throughout the region. Millbrook's share of the recovered funds was being managed by the Citizen Oversight Committee that Tom Bradley had proposed during that first meeting. Instead of rushing into new development projects, the committee had spent months gathering community input about how the money should be used. The consensus was clear: invest in local businesses, infrastructure improvements, and programs that would benefit residents rather than outside developers. My own life had changed dramatically as well. Fresh Start Cleanouts had evolved into something much larger than a simple cleaning service. We now specialized in municipal audits, helping communities identify and eliminate corruption before it could take root. The skills I'd developed investigating Parker's conspiracy had proven valuable in other contexts, and requests for our services were coming from towns throughout the Midwest. But the most satisfying change was personal. Elena Rodriguez had served 18 months in federal prison for her role in Parker's scheme, but she'd also provided crucial testimony that helped secure convictions against higher-level conspirators. When she was released, she'd approached me about making amends for her participation in the fraud. "I know I can't undo what I did," she'd said during our first meeting after her release, "but I'd like to use what I learned to help prevent other communities from going through what Millbrook experienced." Elena now worked for the Community Development Center, using her real estate expertise to help identify suspicious property transactions and development proposals. Her insider knowledge of how corruption schemes operated made her invaluable in training other communities to recognize warning signs. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd unknowingly hired me to clean out the house where Henderson had hidden his evidence was now helping to implement the reforms that evidence had made possible. But Millbrook had become a community that believed in redemption as well as justice, recognizing that people could change if they were given the opportunity and motivation to do so. Lisa Martinez had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the Corruption Network, and her articles had sparked similar investigations in dozens of other states. The Millbrook case had become a model for how federal and local authorities could work together to combat systematic municipal fraud. But perhaps the most important changes were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars recovered or convictions secured. Millbrook had rediscovered its sense of community, its belief that ordinary citizens could make a difference when they worked together toward common goals. The downtown area, which had been gradually hollowed out by Parker's schemes, was experiencing a genuine revival based on local ownership and community investment. The Kowalski building had been rebuilt using recovered funds, and now housed a cooperative market featuring local farmers and artisans. The old Henderson construction office had been converted into a business incubator that helped residents start new enterprises without the regulatory obstacles that had previously blocked local entrepreneurs. Most importantly, Millbrook had implemented governance reforms that made it much harder for future corruption to take root. All city council meetings were live-streamed and archived. Development proposals required extensive public input periods. Financial contracts above a certain threshold had to be reviewed by the Citizen Oversight Committee, These changes hadn't been imposed by outside authorities. They'd been chosen by residents who understood that transparency and accountability were the best defenses against future exploitation. I was reviewing applications for the Community Development Center's small business loan program when David Chen knocked on my office door. At 78, he'd become one of our most active volunteers, using his decades of experience in the community to help evaluate which projects would provide the greatest benefit to residents. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," he said. "Says he's Robert Henderson's son." I looked up in surprise. According to the federal investigation, Henderson's family had relocated to Oregon after his disappearance and had maintained no contact with Millbrook since then. "Did he say what he wanted?" "Just that he'd like to talk with you about his father and what you found in the house." 6 months after the town hall meeting that changed everything, I stood in the renovated Henderson mansion, now serving as Millbrook's Community Development Center. The hidden room where I'd discovered Robert Henderson's evidence had been preserved as a small museum, complete with displays showing how citizens could recognize and resist municipal corruption. It seemed fitting that the space where the truth had been hidden was now dedicated to ensuring transparency. The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks earlier with convictions for James Parker and 17 associates across 5 states. The RICO charges had stuck, resulting in sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years in federal prison. More importantly, the asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered over $60 million that was being returned to defrauded communities throughout the region. Millbrook's share of the recovered funds was being managed by the Citizen Oversight Committee that Tom Bradley had proposed during that first meeting. Instead of rushing into new development projects, the committee had spent months gathering community input about how the money should be used. The consensus was clear: invest in local businesses, infrastructure improvements, and programs that would benefit residents rather than outside developers. My own life had changed dramatically as well. Fresh Start cleanouts had evolved into something much larger than a simple cleaning service. We now specialized in municipal audits, helping communities identify and eliminate corruption before it could take root. The skills I'd developed investigating Parker's conspiracy had proven valuable in other contexts, and requests for our services were coming from towns throughout the Midwest. The most satisfying change was personal. Elena Rodriguez had served 18 months in federal prison for her role in Parker's scheme, but she'd also provided crucial testimony that helped secure convictions against higher-level conspirators. When she was released, she'd approached me about making amends for her participation in the fraud. "I know I can't undo what I did," she'd said during our first meeting after her release. "But I'd like to use what I learned to help prevent other communities from going through what Millbrook experienced." Elena now worked for the Community Development Center, using her real estate expertise to help identify suspicious property transactions and development proposals. Her insider knowledge of how corruption schemes operated made her invaluable in training other communities to recognize warning signs. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd unknowingly hired me to clean out the house where Henderson had hidden his evidence was now helping to implement the reforms that evidence had made possible. But Millbrook had become a community that believed in redemption as well as justice, recognizing that people could change if they were given the opportunity and motivation to do so. Lisa Martinez had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the corruption network, and her articles had sparked similar investigations in dozens of other states. The Millbrook case had become a model for how federal and local authorities could work together to combat systematic municipal fraud. But perhaps the most important changes were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars recovered or convictions secured. Millbrook had rediscovered its sense of community, its belief that ordinary citizens could make a difference when they worked together toward common goals. The downtown area, which had been gradually hollowed out by Parker's schemes, was experiencing a genuine revival based on local ownership and community investment. The Kowalski building had been rebuilt using recovered funds, and now housed a cooperative market featuring local farmers and artisans. The old Henderson construction office had been converted into a business incubator that helped residents start new enterprises without the regulatory obstacles that had previously blocked local entrepreneurs. Most importantly, Millbrook had implemented governance reforms that made it much harder for future corruption to take root. All city council meetings were live-streamed and archived. Development proposals required extensive public input periods. Financial contracts above a certain threshold had to be reviewed by the Citizen Oversight Committee. These changes hadn't been imposed by outside authorities. They'd been chosen by residents who understood that transparency and accountability were the best defenses against future exploitation. I was reviewing applications for the Community Development Center's small business loan program when David Chen knocked on my office door. At 78, he'd become one of our most active volunteers, using his decades of experience in the community to help evaluate which projects would provide the greatest benefit to residents. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," he said. "Says he's Robert Henderson's son." I looked up in surprise. According to the federal investigation, Henderson's family had relocated to Oregon after his disappearance and had maintained no contact with Millbrook since then. "Did he say what he wanted?" "Just that he'd like to talk with you about his father and what you found in the house." The young man waiting in our lobby looked remarkably like the photographs I'd seen of Robert Henderson, though he couldn't have been more than 25 years old. He had the same intelligent eyes and determined expression that had characterized his father in the pictures from Henderson Construction's successful years. "Ms. Mitchell?" "I'm Michael Henderson. Thank you for agreeing to see me." We shook hands, and I led him to the conference room that had been Robert Henderson's study when this was still a family home. The space had been carefully restored to its original appearance, complete with the oak desk where Henderson had worked during his final months in Millbrook. "I wanted to come sooner," Michael said, settling into one of the leather chairs that had been recovered from storage. "But my mother wasn't ready to deal with anything connected to Millbrook until the trials were over. She spent 3 years believing my father was either dead or a criminal. Learning the truth was harder than she expected. I can understand that. The whole situation was traumatic for everyone involved." "She wanted me to give you this," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "It's a letter my father wrote before he disappeared. He gave it to her with instructions to deliver it if anyone ever proved his innocence and exposed what really happened here." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The letter was written in the same careful handwriting I'd become familiar with from Henderson's journals, but the tone was different. This wasn't the voice of a man documenting evidence or building a case. This was a father saying goodbye to everything he'd loved. "Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've accomplished something I couldn't. You've brought the truth into the light where everyone can see it. I don't know who you are or how you found what I left behind, but I know you must be someone special. It takes extraordinary courage to stand up against the kind of power and corruption you've exposed." The letter went on to describe Henderson's hopes for Millbrook's future, his regrets about the family he'd left behind, and his gratitude to whoever had been willing to finish the fight he'd started. But it was the final paragraph that made me cry. "I hope you understand that what you've done isn't just about justice or revenge or even truth. It's about proving that communities can defend themselves, that ordinary people can make a difference, and that the bonds between neighbors are stronger than the greed of those who would exploit them. You've given Millbrook back to its people. Thank you for the gift I couldn't give them myself." He knew he might not survive to see justice done, Michael said quietly. But he believed that someone would care enough to finish what he'd started. He was right about that. We spent the next 2 hours talking about Robert Henderson's life before the corruption scandal destroyed everything. Michael shared stories about his father's dedication to building quality structures that would serve the community for generations, his involvement in local charities, and his genuine love for Millbrook and its residents. "He used to take me to construction sites when I was little," Michael remembered. He'd explain how buildings were more than just structures. They were investments in the community's future. He wanted every project to make Millbrook a better place to live. "Your father's vision is being implemented now," I told him. "The recovery funds are being used exactly the way he would have wanted, to strengthen the community rather than enrich outside investors." "That's actually why I'm here," Michael said. "I wanted to ask if there might be a place for me in what you're building here. I studied urban planning in college, and I've been working for a nonprofit that helps communities recover from economic disasters. What you've accomplished in Millbrook is exactly the kind of work I want to do with my life." The request caught me off guard, but it also felt somehow inevitable. Robert Henderson's legacy wasn't just the evidence he'd left behind, or the corruption he'd exposed. It was the example he'd set of someone willing to sacrifice everything to protect his community. Having his son continue that work seemed like the perfect way to honor both the man and his mission. "We'd be honored to have you join us," I said. "Your father started something important here, and I think he'd be proud to see you helping to finish it." 2 weeks later, Michael Henderson officially joined the Community Development Center as our Director of Municipal Planning. His first project was overseeing the construction of affordable housing on land that had been recovered from Parker's shell companies. The irony was powerful. The same properties that had been stolen to enrich corrupt developers were now being used to provide homes for families who'd been priced out of the market by those same schemes. But Michael's arrival also marked the beginning of a new phase in Millbrook's recovery. The immediate crisis had been resolved, the criminals had been prosecuted, and the stolen assets had been recovered. Now came the harder work of building something better than what had been destroyed. The challenge was that success brought its own problems. Millbrook's story had attracted national attention, and suddenly we were dealing with new development proposals from companies that promised to be different from Parker's operation. Some of these offers were legitimate, but others were simply more sophisticated versions of the same exploitative schemes we'd already defeated. Learning to distinguish between genuine opportunities and disguised threats required constant vigilance. The Citizen Oversight Committee had become expert at identifying red flags in development proposals. But new variations on old scams emerged regularly. More challenging was the pressure to move quickly on reconstruction projects. Federal funds came with spending deadlines, and there was political pressure to show visible progress. But the community had learned the importance of careful deliberation and transparent decision-making, even when it slowed the pace of change. "We could have rebuilt everything in 6 months," Tom Bradley observed during one particularly contentious committee meeting. "But we'd probably just be setting ourselves up for the next James Parker to come along and tear it all down again." The philosophy that emerged from these discussions was that sustainable development required community ownership in every sense of the term. Not just financial investment, but emotional investment. Not just economic benefit, but social benefit. Not just growth, but growth that strengthened rather than displaced the people who called Millbrook home. This approach wasn't always popular with outside observers who were eager to see dramatic transformation. Some critics argued that Millbrook was being too cautious, too suspicious of outside investment, too protective of the status quo. But residents had learned the difference between change that served their interests and change that served someone else's agenda. The vindication came gradually, as other communities that had rushed into new development deals found themselves facing familiar problems. Towns that had embraced outside investment without adequate oversight discovered that their new partners were connected to the same networks that had exploited Millbrook. Communities that had prioritized speed over transparency found themselves dealing with corruption scandals that made their original problems worse. Meanwhile, Millbrook's careful, community-controlled approach was producing steady, sustainable improvements. The downtown business district was thriving with locally owned enterprises. The school system was improving as young families moved back to town. Property values were rising, but in a way that benefited existing residents rather than displacing them. Most importantly, Millbrook had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The Community Development Center was fielding requests for assistance from towns throughout the region, and our methods were being studied by academic researchers and policymakers interested in replicating our success. The transformation wasn't just physical or economic, it was cultural. Millbrook had rediscovered its sense of agency, its belief that residents could shape their community's future through collective action. The passivity and resignation that had characterized the town during Parker's reign had been replaced by engagement and optimism. This change was perhaps most visible during the annual town meeting that had been instituted as part of the governance reforms. What had once been sparsely attended bureaucratic proceedings had become community celebrations, where residents gathered to review progress, discuss challenges, and plan for the future. At this year's meeting held in the renovated community center, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. 18 months earlier, I'd been a struggling small business owner cleaning out abandoned houses and wondering if I'd ever amount to anything more than someone who cleaned up other people's messes. Now I was standing before an audience of neighbors and colleagues, presenting the annual report of an organization that was helping communities throughout the region defend themselves against exploitation and build sustainable, equitable futures for their residents. When I found Robert Henderson's evidence in that hidden room, I told the crowd, I thought I was just discovering the truth about one man's persecution. What I actually found was proof that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary corruption and win. The applause was warm but brief. Millbrook had learned to focus on work rather than celebration, understanding that vigilance was the price of maintaining what they'd achieved. After the meeting, as people gathered in small groups to continue discussions that had started during the formal presentation, I walked outside to get some air. The evening was warm, and I could see lights coming on in houses throughout the residential district. Many of those homes had been saved from foreclosure by the Community Loan Fund. Many of the families inside them had stayed in Millbrook because new opportunities had emerged. Michael Henderson joined me on the steps of the community center. "My father would have loved this," he said, looking out at the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of Parker's schemes. "He made it possible," I replied. "Everything we've accomplished started with his decision to document the truth and hide it where someone could find it." "Not just anyone," Michael corrected. "Someone who cared enough to act on it. Someone who understood that the truth is only powerful if people are willing to fight for it." As we walked back inside, I thought about the letter Henderson had left for me, about his faith that someone would finish what he'd started. He'd been right about the importance of bringing truth into the light, but he'd understood something even more important, that truth without action is meaningless, and action without community support is doomed to fail. The fight against corruption and exploitation wasn't over, and it never would be. There would always be people like James Parker, organizations like Riverside Development Corporation, schemes designed to transfer wealth from communities to corporations. But Millbrook had proven that resistance was possible, that ordinary citizens could educate themselves, organize effectively, and defend their interests against even sophisticated and well-funded opponents. More importantly, we'd proven that the alternative to exploitation wasn't just resistance, but creation, building something better than what had been destroyed, establishing systems that served community interests rather than corporate profits, demonstrating that economic development could strengthen rather than displace the people it was supposed to benefit. As I locked up the community center that night, I paused at the entrance to the small museum that preserved Henderson's hidden room. The space that had once concealed evidence of corruption now displayed information about how other communities could protect themselves from similar schemes. The transformation seemed symbolic of everything that had happened to Millbrook, from secrecy to transparency, from victimization to empowerment, from despair to hope. I thought about my business card, which still read Fresh Start Cleanouts, even though the nature of my work had changed completely. The name felt more appropriate than ever. Sometimes the best way to clean house really was to burn it down and start over. But the real work came afterward. Building something better from the ashes, something worth protecting, something that would serve the people who called it home. The message Robert Henderson had left me would never be forgotten, but its importance wasn't just in the warning it provided about corruption and exploitation. It was in the reminder that every community has the power to determine its own future, if its people are willing to work together and refuse to accept that things have to remain the way they are. Millbrook had taken that lesson to heart, and the results spoke for themselves. We'd transformed from a dying town into a thriving community, from victims of systematic exploitation into models of citizen empowerment, from a place people left behind into a place people chose to call home. The abandoned house on Maple Street that had started this entire journey was now a symbol of renewal rather than decay. But more importantly, it was a reminder that every ending could be a beginning, every loss could become an opportunity, and every act of courage could inspire others to stand up for what they believed in. That was Robert Henderson's real message, and it was one I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.